Paris, January 21st, 1976, 12:40 p.m. local time in France. On the runway at Charles de Gaulle International Airport, a plane was taking off into history. It was the first commercial flight of the first supersonic passenger jet ever. Its destination across the Atlantic Ocean was Rio de Janeiro. Exactly the same day and hour in London, another plane of the same model took off towards Bahrain. This wasn't a coincidence. Air France and British Airways had planned to inaugurate at the same time one of the greatest marvels ever built by humankind, the Concorde. The first aircraft to carry passengers at the speed of sound promised to launch a new era in civil aviation. There was global anticipation that this would start a revolution in the way we travel, a dream of a lasting new age in which distances would grow ever shorter. Crossing the globe in mere hours seemed increasingly real. However, things didn't go as expected. The hope gave way to frustration. The Concorde lasted a few decades and ultimately went out of service. And more than that, no other aircraft took its place. Today, there is no commercial aircraft capable of traveling at supersonic speeds. The impression left is that airplanes got stuck in time. But why exactly? Why did this happen? To understand how humanity created a plane faster than sound and why it ceased to exist, we need to go back to the early history of aviation. The desire to fly has always captivated human imagination, and the first attempt to build a flying machine took place in ancient Greece. Nearly 2,500 years ago, the mathematician Archytas of Tarentum developed a prototype he called the dove. Not many details are known, but it's believed to have been an unmanned object, possibly powered by compressed air that glided about 200 meters. In the following century, the Chinese created a flying object you still know today as a kite. Over the centuries, inventive new objects capable of flying emerged, but none were suited for carrying humans. A balloonist might have benefited from knowing this. By the 15th century, however, an inventor took on the challenge of designing a machine that could make man take flight. His name was Leonardo da Vinci. The Renaissance genius created plans for several flying machines, including early sketches of a helicopter, a glider, and even an unusual device called an ornithopter, a wing-flapping contraption meant to imitate birds. Amazingly, knowledge and materials of the time couldn't bring his designs to life or lift humanity off the ground. But if these machines exist today, credit is due to Da Vinci. Yes, these machines do exist. Even an ornithopter. The pilot sits in a cabin, pressing a pedal to gently flap the wings. Sure, it only flies about 100 meters, but it's a start for leg workouts. Returning to our aviation story, the first human flights only happened in the 18th century, in what we know well today as the hot air balloon. This journey began when the French Montgolfier brothers observed how a fire could inflate a silk sack and got an idea. In 1783, they launched the first manned balloon. The passengers were a sheep, a rooster, and a duck. Only after a successful test did they decide to place a human in the balloon, leading to Professor Jean-François de Rosier's place in our story. He became the first person to fly and the first to die in an air accident. But not on his maiden voyage. The first flight went smoothly, but his ambitions to cross the English Channel led to his fatal mistake. In the years that followed, other flying machines like the dirigible were developed. With a similar design to a balloon, it could control its direction with rudders and motors. Yet true aviation revolution emerged with the airplane. As we know, it was invented by Brazilian Alberto Santos Dumont. I say we know because in many parts of the world, credit goes to the American Wright brothers. This rivalry depends on what counts as the first airplane flight. The Wright Flyer took off first in 1903, but it required wind, rails, or a catapult. Santos Dumont's 14 bis flew 3 years later with its own propulsion. So, who's the father of aviation? Opinions vary, but in Brazil, it's Santos Dumont. The 20th century saw airplanes proliferate, fueled by a fast-developing technology driven largely by wars. Aircraft were used for military strategy, attacks, and reconnaissance, changing both warfare and flight. Before World War I, planes rarely exceeded 100 km per hour, but by the end many could reach 230 km per hour. Improvements like aluminum replacing wood, stronger engines, and larger designs allowed more passengers on board. This progress led to the establishment of major airlines, some still around today, like Air France, KLM, and Lufthansa. The 1930s marked the golden age of aviation, with advances in aerodynamics for more efficient aircraft, navigation and communication technologies for safer flights, and pressurized cabins allowing higher, smoother travel. But then came another world war. Sadly, in the 1940s, aircraft were used in one of history's most devastating attacks, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which killed an estimated 200,000 and left lasting health effects. On a technical front, World War II further propelled aviation innovation, such as the jet engine. This technology, which compresses, ignites, and expels air at high speeds, pushed aircraft speeds close to 1,000 km per hour. With this new velocity, large commercial flights took off in the following years. But the dream of transporting more people to farther destinations faster inspired bolder plans. In the 1960s, an even more ambitious project was born. Entrepreneurs, engineers, physicists, and other experts gathered to revolutionize flight. Their goal was to create a plane capable of flying faster than sound, about 1,200 kilometers per hour. Remember, at this time, the Cold War was dividing the world into capitalist and socialist blocs led by the United States and the Soviet Union, respectively. Both competed for global dominance across politics, economics, and other areas. Some events, like the space race, are well known, but what many people don't realize is that the Cold War powers also engaged in, let's say, a supersonic race. While the Western Bloc was developing the Concorde, as I mentioned earlier in this video, the Soviets were working on their own supersonic jet, known as the Concorde. Well, that was a joke, actually. Some did nickname it this way, but its real name was Tupolev Tu-144. Just as in space exploration, where the Soviets claimed many early victories, like launching the first satellite and sending the first human into space, they also took the lead in this supersonic race. On June 5, 1969, in a test flight, the Tupolev became the first aircraft in history to break the sound barrier. The following year, it doubled that speed, reaching an incredible 2,500 kilometers per hour. But why does everyone remember the Concorde and few know the Tupolev? The Soviet plane faced serious issues. Its story was surrounded by suspicions that Soviet spies had stolen Concorde's plans, though that was never confirmed. Beyond this, the Tu-144 encountered even graver issues. In 1973, before its commercial debut, a demonstration flight ended in tragedy as the plane broke apart mid-air, killing all 6 on board and 8 people on the ground. The Soviets were vague about the accident's cause but recognized the need for design modifications, which led to the Tupolev's temporary use as a cargo plane. After around 50 cargo flights, it finally began carrying passengers, though it only completed about 50 such flights due to the high operating costs. Additionally, passengers reported an unpleasant experience. As the plane was so noisy, they could barely hear the person sitting next to them. The Tu-144 had many other issues. In total, 226 failures were officially recorded across just 181 hours of flight. These problems ultimately rendered its operations unsustainable, leading to the project's abandonment by the late 1970s. Meanwhile, its western cousin, the Concorde, had a much different fate. The Concorde project began in the early 1960s during a booming period for US aerospace. This prompted 2 European nations to join forces to boost their economies and counter US dominance. The countries were France and England. Each had expertise in different areas. The French excelled in system design, while the British specialized in engine production. They combined their knowledge to create a supersonic aircraft and, in honor of this union, named it Concorde. But there was an immediate debate should the name be in English Concorde or French Concorde. The argument nearly derailed the project, with England initially refusing to include the E, claiming it represented Europe. You see where this is going? Once that essential debate was settled, engineers focused on the technological challenges of building such a fast plane. At supersonic speeds, air friction generates extreme heat, so materials were chosen carefully to prevent overheating. A key innovation was the fly-by-wire system, which replaced the traditional springs and pulleys with electrical signals to control moving parts, a system now standard in most modern aircraft. After all this investment, the Concorde first took to the skies on March 2, 1969, though it didn't carry passengers until January 1976, as mentioned at the start of this video. In total, 20 Concordes we built 6 prototypes and 14 commercial jets operated by British Airways and Air France. A former CEO of the French airline described the Concorde as the most beautiful flying object ever created. Flying Concorde was a luxurious experience. Though the seats were somewhat narrow, the onboard service was highly upscale. Renowned chefs designed the menu, offering dishes like lobster and caviar. Drinks were equally high quality, including vodka and champagne. But the greatest highlight was the speed. A display visible to passengers showed their velocity, which climbed until a flight attendant made the announcement everyone anticipated. "Welcome to supersonic flight." This announcement marked the exact moment the plane reached Mach 1, the speed of sound. To put it in perspective, the Concorde's classic London to New York route took less than 3.5 hours. Considering the 5-hour time difference, passengers would arrive before they had technically departed. In other words, they could have lunch in London at noon, board the Concorde, and still enjoy breakfast in New York at 10:30 a.m. The Paris-Rio route was also much faster than a regular flight. While this journey takes nearly 12 hours today, the Concorde completed it in around 6 hours, including a refueling stop in Senegal. But if these flights were so fast, why did Concorde meet its end? One early obstacle was the plane's speed. Whenever an object exceeds the speed of sound, it produces a sonic boom. As a body moves faster, sound waves compress, and upon surpassing sound speed, they form a powerful shock wave. This results in a loud, explosive sound that can shake windows below. For this reason, supersonic flights were briefly banned in the US, though the restriction was eventually lifted, allowing Concorde to fly in American airspace. The main barrier, however, was financial. Operating such a fast plane was extremely costly. Ticket prices exceeded $10,000, far above a conventional first-class fare. Few people could afford such a journey, making it challenging to fill the plane. On top of that, the cost of fuel skyrocketed as the project began when oil was cheap. But by the time Concorde became operational, more than a decade later, oil prices had tripled due to global conflicts and geopolitical crises. The cost of supersonic flights increased dramatically, especially with the Concorde consuming 25,000 liters of fuel per hour. And if you think your car's fuel consumption is bad, think again. That's why, throughout the 80s and 90s, supersonic flights became synonymous with financial losses for airlines. Eventually, in the early 2000s, two major events put an end to the Concorde. The first was a fatal accident in Paris in July 2000. A fire caused an Air France Concorde to crash, killing all 109 people on board and 4 others on the ground. The model was grounded for over a year until safety modifications were made. The Concorde returned to flight in November 2001, but by then, the aviation world had already been impacted by another tragedy, September 11. The attacks on the World Trade Center caused a global aviation crisis and impacted Concorde operations in a surprising way. Many of the regular Concorde passengers worked in the towers, executives and business professionals who were among the few able to afford the high cost of supersonic travel for meetings in Europe. With their loss, demand for the Concorde diminished, leading to an inevitable outcome. Tired of losses, British Airways and Air France decided to end Concorde operations, and on November 26, 2003, in England, the Concorde landed for the last time. Thus ended the story of an aircraft that promised to forever change air travel but lasted less than 30 years. More than just the end of a plane, it marked the end of an era in aviation. And the century that saw the farewell to supersonic flights also witnessed the decline of giant airplanes. The so-called jumbo jets have also been losing their place in the skies. Take the Boeing 747-400, a colossal 70-meter-long plane capable of carrying up to 660 passengers. In recent years, Australian airline Qantas retired its fleet, British Airways ceased passenger operations with it, and American Airlines now use only cargo versions of the giant. Airbus faced a similar story with the A380, as Lufthansa returned planes to the manufacturer. Air France ceased operations, and Emirates replaced part of its orders with two-engine versions. These decisions were made for the same reason. Economics. Giant planes are less efficient and more costly to fuel and maintain. To stay profitable, Airlines need to sell almost every seat on each flight, which isn't always easy. Thus, companies are focusing on smaller, more affordable planes, even if that means more stops. No wonder the Boeing 737, a commercial aircraft that isn't as fast or large as others, remains the best-selling model since its launch in the 60s. This trend is also visible in military aviation. The B-52 bomber, first launched in the 1950s, is expected to keep flying for decades, potentially reaching a century in service. Similarly, the F-16 fighter jet, developed 50 years ago, remains highly sought after worldwide, with its perfect size and weight for aerial combat maneuvers, study build for high G-forces, and cockpit layout providing optimal visibility. Its joystick-style controller on the right, combined with fly-by-wire technology, has become a staple in military aviation. This cost-effectiveness means it isn't practical to replace perfectly functional aircraft with the costly new models. It's the classic don't change a winning team. All of this may give the impression that aviation has stagnated. Everything I've covered so far explains why the industry moved away from larger and faster planes, but it doesn't mean nothing has changed in recent years. Boeing's Eco-Demonstrator project, for instance, tests new technologies on non-commercial flights before they're fully implemented. In recent years, dozens of innovations have been trialed, from laser systems for turbulence prediction, wireless sensors to reduce aircraft weight, new wing coatings to minimize ice and insect buildup, to biodiesel from sugarcane. These are just a few examples of what the future holds. All of this is amazing, but what about supersonic flights? Is there any hope of flying faster than the speed of sound again? The answer is yes. A new supersonic plane is being developed. The Overture by Boom Supersonic, an American manufacturer. It's still in testing, with its first flight in March of this year, though it has yet to reach supersonic speeds. Commercial flights are expected to begin around 2029. Major airlines like American, United, and Japan Airlines have already ordered 130 of these planes, which will carry up to 80 passengers. The Overture is projected to reach Mach 1.7, or 1.7 times the speed of sound. That's roughly 1,800 kilometers per hour, allowing for a Miami to London flight, typically 10 hours in just 5. To avoid the sonic boom I mentioned earlier, the Overture will fly at Mach 0.94, just below the speed of sound, over land, accelerating fully only over the ocean. Environmentally, Boom Supersonic promises to forego traditional jet fuel in favor of SAF, or sustainable aviation fuel. This fuel is derived from renewable resources like vegetable oils and organic waste. The key challenge remains economic viability, as this was the main hurdle for the Concorde. I'm personally very curious about what it will be like to fly in the Overture, though I'd rather not imagine the ticket price. For now, all we can do is wait and follow each step of this fantastic supersonic journey, not just here on Earth, but across the skies. After all, besides chasing speed, airlines are also looking to space. This year, Boeing launched its first flight to the International Space Station in partnership with NASA. This venture adds Boeing to the exclusive group pushing the frontiers of space exploration. And over the next decade, We should witness not only the return of supersonic flights, but also, as I've covered on this channel, the return of humans to the moon. There's even talk of a lunar base potentially paving the way to Mars. That is, if our bodies can handle it. These projects remind us that going far is just as important as going fast. They show that in humanity's relentless quest for new frontiers, even the sky isn't the limit. Thank you and see you next time. I hope you agree that this was a great video. Goodbye.